Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, we have a fascinating story that will not only teach you about history, but also help improve your English. So, stay with us until the end. Have you ever wondered what it takes to build a nation from scratch? Imagine leading an army against the most powerful empire of the time, winning against all odds, and then becoming the very first president of a brand new country. Sounds like something out of a movie, right? Well, this was the life of George Washington, the man who shaped the United States into what it is today. Washington wasn't just a war hero, he was a visionary, a leader, and a man who set the foundations for democracy as we know it. But his story isn't just about glory and success. He faced incredible challenges, tough decisions, and even controversial aspects that continue to spark debates today. By the end of this video, you'll have a complete picture of who George Washington really was, beyond the textbooks, beyond the myths, and beyond the dollar bill. So, if you're ready to dive into one of the most fascinating lives in history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments, what do you admire the most about George Washington? Now, let's begin with the story of how a young boy from Virginia became the most influential man in American history. George Washington's story begins on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Born into a modest plantation-owning family, he was the eldest son of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. While his family wasn't poor, they were far from the wealthiest in the colony. Unlike many of his future peers, Washington never received a formal education in Europe, a fact that made him self-conscious throughout his life. From a young age, Washington showed a deep interest in military affairs and land surveying. When he was just 11 years old, his father passed away, leaving the family's financial future uncertain. This forced young George to mature quickly, as his formal education was cut short, and he had to start working early. Washington's first major break came at the age of 16, when he joined a surveying expedition in the rugged Shenandoah Valley. The experience toughened him up, exposed him to the wilderness, and taught him valuable survival and leadership skills. By the time he was 17, he had secured a job as the official surveyor of Culper County, Virginia, a position that not only earned him respect, but also helped him develop a deep understanding of land, property, and colonial expansion. At 21 years old, Washington received his first taste of military leadership. In 1753, Virginia's Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent him on a dangerous mission to the Ohio Valley to deliver a message to the French, demanding they leave British territory. This mission was Washington's first step into the world of war and diplomacy. Although the French refused to leave, Washington's bravery caught the attention of colonial leaders. A year later, he led an attack against a French scouting party, sparking the French and Indian War, a brutal conflict that pitted the British against the French and their Native American allies. Washington's courage and resilience in battle, despite suffering defeats, earned him a reputation as a fearless young officer. By the time the war ended in 1763, Washington had gained invaluable battlefield experience, but he also witnessed the arrogance of British officers toward colonial soldiers. This treatment planted the seeds of resentment that would later drive him toward revolution. With his military career on hold, Washington turned to another passion, farming and politics. He married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow, which significantly increased his social and financial standing. Settling in Mount Vernon, Washington became a respected figure in Virginia's political circles. However, tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown were escalating, and Washington knew that the time for action was approaching. He had no idea that within a decade, he would be leading an entire army against the British in a fight for freedom and independence. By the early 1770s, tensions between the American colonies and the British government had reached a breaking point. The British imposed harsh taxes on the colonies, like the Stamp Act, 1765, and the Townshend Acts, 1767, without giving them any say in Parliament. This led to the famous colonial slogan, "No taxation without representation." George Washington, like many other influential Virginians, was growing increasingly frustrated. Although he was a wealthy plantation owner, he sympathized with the struggles of common colonists. At first, Washington preferred diplomatic solutions, but as Britain tightened its grip, he realized that only a revolution could bring real change. From farmer to fighter, Washington joins the revolution. When Britain passed the Coercive Acts, 1774, which punished Boston for the Boston Tea Party, Washington had had enough. He joined the First Continental Congress, a gathering of colonial leaders who debated how to respond to British oppression. Washington didn't speak much, but his presence alone commanded respect. Then, in April 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired in Lexington and Concord. The colonies were at war, but they needed a strong leader to unite them. Who would lead the fight against the mighty British Empire? In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress unanimously chose Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He was not the most experienced general, but he was well respected, disciplined, and, most importantly, he was from Virginia, the largest and most influential colony. Washington accepted the role, but he had doubts. The Continental Army was poorly trained, badly equipped, and constantly short on supplies. Meanwhile, the British had the most powerful military in the world. The odds were stacked against him, yet he never backed down. Washington's first major challenge was the Siege of Boston, 1775 to 1776. The British controlled the city, but Washington led a brilliant operation, using cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to force the British to evacuate. This boosted morale, but bigger battles lay ahead. One of Washington's greatest defeats came in New York, 1776. The British crushed the Continental Army, forcing Washington into a desperate retreat. Many generals would have surrendered, but Washington refused to give up. He retreated across the Delaware River and prepared for a daring comeback. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington led one of the boldest military moves in American history. With his army on the brink of collapse, he crossed the icy Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on Hessian, German, troops in Trenton, New Jersey. The victory revived the Revolution, proving that the Americans still had fight left in them. Washington had now transformed from a reluctant soldier into a full-fledged revolutionary leader. But the war was far from over, and his greatest challenges were still ahead. After the stunning victory at Trenton, Washington knew the war was far from over. The Continental Army was exhausted, poorly equipped, and constantly on the verge of collapse. The British still controlled key cities and had more resources, experienced soldiers, and a dominant navy. To win, Washington couldn't simply fight the British head-on. He needed to be smarter, more resilient, and turn his disorganized troops into a force capable of resisting the might of the most powerful empire of the time. The real test came in late 1777, when the British captured Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital. Washington had failed to stop them, and the Continental Army was forced to retreat to Valley Forge, where they would endure one of the harshest winters of the war. The conditions were unbearable: freezing temperatures, a severe lack of food, and outbreaks of disease devastated the troops. Many soldiers had no shoes, leaving trails of blood in the snow. Small tents housed dozens of men, who fell sick rapidly, and hunger became so extreme that some resorted to boiling leather from their uniforms, just to have something to eat. Morale hit rock bottom, and Washington knew that if his army lost hope, the revolution would crumble. Unlike many military leaders, he did not isolate himself in safety while his men suffered. Washington walked among the soldiers, sharing in their hardships, writing desperate letters to Congress pleading for supplies, and doing everything in his power to keep the army from dissolving. His presence alone kept many from deserting, but survival was not enough. He needed to transform this ragtag group into a professional army. The answer came in the form of Baron von Steuben, a disciplined Prussian officer who offered to train Washington's troops. In just a few months, Steuben reorganized the army completely, introducing advanced combat techniques and European military discipline. By spring, the men who had suffered through the Valley Forge winter emerged stronger and more prepared for the battles ahead. Meanwhile, in the north, the war took an unexpected turn. In October 1777, American forces achieved a decisive victory at Saratoga, stunning the British. This battle changed everything. The world now saw that the colonists had a real chance to win, and as a result, France officially allied with the United States. This alliance was a game-changer. The French sent soldiers, money, and most importantly, their powerful navy, which helped weaken Britain's dominance at sea. What had once seemed like a minor colonial rebellion had now escalated into a global war. Over time, the British began to lose control of the conflict. By 1781, Washington saw the perfect opportunity to deliver the final blow. British General Lord Cornwallis had stationed his forces in Yorktown, Virginia, believing his position was secure. But Washington, alongside French General Rocambie, devised a brilliant strategy. While the American and French armies surrounded Yorktown on land, the French navy blocked any escape by sea. Completely trapped, Cornwallis was forced to surrender on October 19, 1781. The war was effectively over. Even with victory secured, Washington remained cautious. He knew that until peace treaties were signed, there was always a chance the British might return. Finally, in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris, the United States was officially recognized as an independent nation. Washington, now a national hero, stunned the world with what he did next. Instead of using his fame and power to seize control, he resigned as commander-in-chief and returned to his home at Mount Vernon. This decision shocked many. Victorious military leaders throughout history had almost always become kings, dictators, or rulers for life, but Washington proved he was different. He showed that the revolution was not about him. It was about building a new nation based on freedom and self-governance. With the war finally over, what was next for Washington? He believed his public service was done, but fate had one final role for him to play, becoming the first president of the United States. After years of war and sacrifice, George Washington finally returned to his beloved Mount Vernon in 1783. He hoped to spend the rest of his life as a farmer, away from politics. However, the nation he had fought so hard to create was now in desperate need of leadership. The United States had won independence, but the new government was weak, unstable, and on the verge of collapse. Without a strong leader, everything Washington and his fellow revolutionaries had fought for could be lost. In 1787, Washington was reluctantly pulled back into public service when he was chosen to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The original government, established under the Articles of Confederation, had too many flaws, states had too much power, and the national government had almost none. It was Washington's presence at the convention that helped unite the delegates as they drafted the U.S. Constitution, creating the government system that still exists today. 2 years later, in 1789, the United States held its first-ever presidential election. Washington was the unanimous choice, receiving every single electoral vote. On April 30, 1789, he took the oath of office in New York City, the nation's first capital, becoming the first president of the United States. But even though he was now the most powerful man in the country, he never saw himself as a king or ruler. He viewed the presidency as a temporary duty, not a lifelong position. As the first president, Washington faced an enormous challenge. The country had no precedent for how a president should govern, and every decision he made would set the foundation for future leaders. One of his first priorities was establishing a strong federal government. He appointed some of the nation's brightest minds to his cabinet, including Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Hamilton pushed for a strong national economy, advocating for the creation of a national bank and policies that would help stabilize the country's finances. Meanwhile, Jefferson favored a limited federal government, believing that states should have more power. Washington had to carefully navigate these opposing views, ensuring that the young nation did not tear itself apart. Another critical challenge was foreign policy. The United States was a young and vulnerable country surrounded by powerful nations. Washington knew that getting involved in European conflicts, especially between Britain and France, could destroy the fragile republic before it even had a chance to grow. In 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, keeping the U.S. out of European wars, despite pressure from both sides. This decision set a precedent for American foreign policy that would last for over a century. Domestically, Washington also had to deal with internal rebellions. In 1794, farmers in Pennsylvania protested against a tax on whiskey, known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Instead of letting chaos take over, Washington personally led 13,000 troops to suppress the rebellion, proving that the federal government had the power to enforce its laws. Unlike the British monarchy, Washington did not use this power to oppress the people, but rather to maintain order and stability. By the end of his second term, Washington had grown tired of politics. He could have easily remained president for life, as many wanted, but he made the historic decision to step down after 2 terms. In his farewell address in 1796, he warned against political divisions, urged the nation to avoid permanent alliances with foreign countries, and emphasized the importance of unity. His voluntary departure from power set a democratic precedent, one that would later be written into law with the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidents to 2 terms. After 8 years as president, Washington once again returned to Mount Vernon, this time for good. He had shaped the presidency, stabilized a fragile nation, and proved that power should be temporary, not something to be held onto indefinitely. His leadership had transformed the United States from a fragile experiment into a functioning country. However, his legacy was not without its controversies. While he fought for liberty and justice, he was also a slave owner, a contradiction that historians continue to debate today. Even in retirement, Washington wrestled with the issue of slavery, and in his will, he made the groundbreaking decision to free his enslaved workers upon his wife's death, a rare action among wealthy plantation owners of his time. With his presidency over, Washington hoped to live out his final years in peace, but fate had one last challenge for him to face. His final days and lasting legacy would soon cement his place as one of history's greatest leaders. As George Washington stepped away from the presidency in 1797, he left behind a nation still in its infancy. Yet, his leadership had already set many of the fundamental traditions that future presidents would follow. Washington had not only established what it meant to be the President of the United States, but he also ensured that the office remained a position of service, not of absolute power. One of his greatest contributions was the establishment of executive authority without tyranny. Unlike European monarchs who ruled for life, Washington chose to serve only 2 terms, reinforcing the idea that American leaders should not cling to power indefinitely. His decision set a precedent that would last until Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency in the 20th century and later became law under the 22nd Amendment, officially limiting presidents to 2 terms. This single act distinguished the United States from many other nations where leaders often refused to step down. Washington also shaped the presidency through his use of executive power. While he strongly believed in democracy, he also understood that the federal government needed authority to function effectively. His firm response to the Whiskey Rebellion proved that the new government had the strength to enforce laws while still respecting the rights of its citizens. Without his leadership, the young nation could have fallen into chaos or fragmented into smaller, weaker states. Another defining aspect of his legacy was his commitment to neutrality in foreign affairs. During his presidency, Washington faced immense pressure to support either Britain or France in their ongoing war. However, he knew that the United States was not strong enough to be entangled in European conflicts. By issuing the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, he laid the foundation for a foreign policy that prioritized American interests above foreign alliances. This approach guided U.S. diplomacy for over a century, influencing leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe. Even today, Washington's belief in avoiding unnecessary foreign entanglements remains a cornerstone of American foreign policy discussions. His influence also extended to the formation of the U.S. economy. Although Washington himself was not an economist, he trusted Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, to implement policies that would strengthen the country's financial system. Hamilton's vision of a national bank, a strong central government, and industrial growth was supported by Washington, laying the economic foundations that helped the U.S. transition from a struggling republic into an emerging power. Without Washington's backing, Hamilton's financial plan might never have been implemented, and the nation could have remained economically fragile. Beyond politics and economics, Washington set an example of personal integrity and civic duty. He refused to be addressed with extravagant titles, preferring the simple and democratic, Mr. President, instead of the European-style titles some had suggested, such as His Excellency or His Highness. This decision reinforced the idea that the American president was a servant of the people, not a ruler above them. However, despite his many contributions, Washington's legacy is not without its controversial aspects. One of the most debated topics is his role as a slave owner. For much of his life, Washington owned enslaved people at Mount Vernon, and although he expressed discomfort with the institution in his later years, he did not publicly advocate for abolition. In his will, he made the unprecedented decision to free his enslaved workers upon his wife Martha's death, making him one of the few founding fathers to take such action. While this was a progressive step for his time, it does not erase the fact that he benefited from slavery for most of his life, a reality that continues to be examined by historians today. Despite these complexities, Washington's legacy remains one of the most influential in American history. His leadership, character, and vision shaped the presidency, the government, and even the cultural identity of the United States. To this day, his image is everywhere, from the $1 bill to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., named in his honor. His farewell address, in which he warned against political divisions and excessive foreign alliances, is still studied by leaders and historians alike. Even as he retired to Mount Vernon, Washington's influence on the nation never faded. But his final years would bring one last challenge: his own mortality. As he approached the end of his life, he prepared to leave behind not just a country, but a legacy that would define the very nature of leadership for generations to come. George Washington is often remembered as a fearless leader, the father of a nation, and a symbol of democracy. However, like any historical figure, he was not without flaws. His legacy is complex, filled with controversies, difficult decisions, and contradictions that continue to spark debate today. While his leadership shaped the United States, certain aspects of his life remain a topic of scrutiny and re-evaluation. One of the most controversial aspects of Washington's legacy is his relationship with slavery. Despite fighting for freedom from British rule, Washington enslaved hundreds of people at his Mount Vernon estate. At the peak of his wealth, he owned more than 300 enslaved individuals, who worked on his plantation in harsh conditions. Washington benefited from their labor and, for most of his life, did not take public action against the institution of slavery. Even as the country moved toward independence, he did not advocate for the freedom of enslaved people, reflecting the deep contradictions within the founding ideals of the United States. However, Washington's personal views on slavery seemed to shift in his later years. He privately expressed discomfort with the practice, stating that he wished to see slavery abolished gradually. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he refused to sell enslaved people for profit, keeping families together whenever possible. His last will and testament included an unprecedented decision. He ordered that his enslaved workers be freed upon his wife's death, making him the only founding father to take such a step. While this was significant, it does not erase the fact that he benefited from slavery for most of his life, a reality that complicates his image as a champion of liberty. Another controversial aspect of Washington's presidency was his firm approach to domestic conflicts. While he is celebrated for uniting the country, some of his actions caused division. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was one such moment. When farmers in Pennsylvania protested against a tax on whiskey, arguing that it was unfair and oppressive, Washington responded with military force, personally leading 13,000 troops to suppress the rebellion. Some saw this as necessary to enforce federal laws, while others criticized it as an overreach of government power, fearing that Washington was acting like the very monarchy he had fought against. Washington's presidency also witnessed the rise of political parties, something he deeply opposed. He believed that political factions would divide the nation, yet during his time in office, the country split into two competing groups: the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who supported a strong central government, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who favored states' rights. Although Washington tried to remain neutral, his policies often aligned with Hamilton, leading critics to argue that he favored the wealthy elite over common citizens. His foreign policy decisions were equally controversial. When war broke out between Britain and France in the 1790s, many Americans wanted to support France, the nation that had helped them during the Revolutionary War. However, Washington prioritized stability over loyalty, choosing to keep the U.S. neutral. His proclamation of neutrality, 1793, prevented the young nation from being dragged into European conflicts, but it also angered pro-French citizens, who saw it as a betrayal. Washington also approved the Jay Treaty, 1794, an agreement with Britain that sought to prevent war and maintain trade relations. While the treaty avoided another costly conflict, it heavily favored British interests, causing outrage among Jeffersonian Republicans. Many viewed it as a sign of weakness, believing Washington had given too many concessions to the same empire the U.S. had just fought for independence. The treaty fueled political divisions, marking one of the first major controversies in American foreign policy. Despite these criticisms, Washington remained highly respected, and his leadership set the standard for future presidents. His ability to balance power, make difficult decisions, and step away from office voluntarily defined him as a leader of exceptional integrity. However, his presidency also demonstrated that no leader is perfect, and even the most admired figures are shaped by the complexities of their time. As Washington entered his final years, he had already secured his place in history. But his last moments on Earth would become just as legendary as the life he had lived. After stepping down from the presidency in 1797, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon, finally free from the burdens of political life. At 65 years old, he was ready to spend his remaining years in peace, managing his estate, enjoying time with his wife, Martha, and distancing himself from the growing tensions in American politics. However, even in retirement, Washington's influence remained unparalleled, and the country he helped create was still in need of his guidance. Despite his wishes to stay out of politics, Washington was constantly consulted by leaders, including his successor, John Adams. The rising tensions between the U.S. and France led to an undeclared naval conflict known as the Quasi-War, and in 1798, President Adams called Washington back into service, appointing him as the commander of the U.S. Army in case of a full-scale war. Though Washington accepted, he made it clear that he would not actively lead troops, his role would be purely strategic. Fortunately, war never broke out, and Washington never had to return to the battlefield. As the months passed, Washington remained devoted to his plantation, overseeing its operations and ensuring his workers had what they needed. However, his health began to decline. In December 1799, after riding on horseback through his estate in freezing rain, Washington developed a severe throat infection. Over the next 2 days, his condition worsened rapidly. In an attempt to cure him, doctors used bloodletting, a common medical practice at the time, draining over 40% of his blood, a treatment that likely weakened him even further. On December 14, 1799, George Washington passed away, at the age of 67. His last words, spoken to his secretary, were simple yet powerful: "'Tis well." The nation was devastated. News of his death spread rapidly, and the mourning was unprecedented. Across the country, memorial services were held, and tributes poured in from world leaders, including Napoleon Bonaparte, who ordered a 10-day period of mourning in France. Washington's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy would live on forever. His decision to voluntarily give up power set a democratic precedent that would shape the presidency for centuries. His leadership during the Revolutionary War, his role in drafting the Constitution, and his steady guidance as the first president established the foundations of the United States. Even today, Washington's influence is deeply woven into American culture. His face is engraved on Mount Rushmore and printed on the $1 bill. The nation's capital, Washington, D.C., bears his name, and countless schools, cities, and landmarks across the country honor his memory. His famous farewell address, in which he warned against political divisions and foreign entanglements, is still referenced by politicians and historians as a timeless lesson in leadership. Yet, Washington's legacy is not just about his accomplishments, it is about the principles he stood for. He proved that leadership is not about personal power, but about service, humility, and the willingness to step aside for the greater good. He showed the world that a nation built on freedom, democracy, and unity could not only survive but thrive. More than 2 centuries after his death, George Washington remains a symbol of strength, integrity, and the enduring spirit of the United States. His story is a testament to the power of vision, perseverance, and the belief that even the most ambitious dreams, like the birth of a new nation, can become reality. George Washington's story is more than just the tale of a revolutionary hero. It is the story of a man who shaped the very foundation of a nation. From his early struggles as a young soldier to his victories in battle, from his leadership as the first president to his decision to walk away from power, Washington set a standard for what it means to be a true leader. His choices did not just impact his time, they influenced generations, setting the course for the future of the United States. But Washington was not perfect. His legacy is complex, filled with both triumphs and contradictions. He fought for freedom while owning slaves, he warned against political divisions while struggling to prevent them, and he built a democracy in a time when many were still excluded from it. Yet, despite his flaws, his vision, integrity, and commitment to the ideals of self-governance left an impact that cannot be denied. Even today, Washington remains a symbol of leadership, resilience, and the pursuit of a greater cause. His legacy reminds us that true greatness is not about power, it is about service, sacrifice, and the courage to do what is right, even in the face of impossible odds. What do you think was Washington's greatest achievement? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can learn about the fascinating lives of history's greatest figures. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.